Hi, I'm Elise Upidis. I'm the public art curator at the List, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the 2011 Max Wasserman Forum on Contemporary Art. This annual forum was established in memory of Max Wasserman, MIT class of 1935, a founding member of the Council of the Arts at MIT, and is made possible through the generosity of the late Jeanne Wasserman. I am pleased their son, Peter, is in the audience today. And if I may remind you, please turn off your cell phones for the duration of the forum. I'm grateful to members of the List's Advisory Committee who have so generously given their time, shared their knowledge, provided the considered reflection, and contributed to the conversation that has been instrumental to making this year's forum possible. Jerry Friedman, Per Jostrup, John Hendricks, Marion Merrill, Andrea Miller-Keller, David Solo, and Jean Staton. I would like to thank my excellent colleagues at the List, Acting Director David Freylock, Registrar Diane Kalick, Education and PR Officer Mark Linga, Gallery Manager Tim Lloyd, Gallery Assistant John Osario Buck, Administrative Assistant Barbara Pine, Curator Joao Ribas, Web Assistant Danny LaFontaine, and volunteers Cree Bruins, Jill Fisher, Savory Hinton, Andrea Rosen, Hilary Redder, and Angelina Joao. I would like to extend my deep gratitude to the coordinator of this year's forum, Zuzana Zagedi. This year's forum, Past, Present, Contemporary Art, and the Uses of History, is a framework to discuss how artists use historical subject matter in their work, how they engage theories and methods of historical research, and how artistic practice might call into question historical narratives and receive notions of historical time. But rather than elaborating on what the speakers will be discussing, and without further delay, I would like to introduce the moderator of this year's forum, Tim Griffin. Tim is Executive Director and Chief Curator of The Kitchen, New York. He was Editor-in-Chief of Art Forum from 2003 to 2010, during which time he devoted thematic issues to subjects such as globalization, art and politics, performance, the art market, and the Contemporary Art Museum. He also organized special focuses on Michael Clark, Jacques Renault, and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and commissioned projects from Cyprien Galliard, Ronnie Horn, Michael Kreber, and Sherry Levine, among many others. Griffin's writing on the arts has appeared in publications ranging from Vogue to October, whose summer 2011 issue featured his essay Compression, which considers shifting terms for site specificity in contemporary art and is the basis for a book forthcoming from Sternberg Press in 2012. In his essays, Griffin has considered work by figures including Chantal Ackerman, Don Baldessari, Yvonne Rayner, and Kelly Walker. In 2010, he was senior advisor on the Serpentine Gallery's Poetry Marathon, for which he has also interviewed poets John Ashbery and Edouard Glissant. Please welcome Tim Griffin.
So, first, I'd really like to express my gratitude to the List for inviting me to take part in today's conversation with a fantastic group of people, all of whom actually, and very happily, I have a degree of personal history with, given that most particularly we've collaborated on a number of writing projects over the years. And inevitably, I think with that in mind, my brief opening remarks here will be inflected by this fact, bearing in mind in particular Douglas Crimp's adage On the Museum's Ruins, that what each of us sees is his or her own individual history. Our individual pasts give shape to what we observe, and alternatively to what remains invisible to us or indiscernible. And actually knowing some of the people here, I couldn't help but I found it irresistible to have as a kind of illustration of that. Images from a visit of mine in 2007 to Bruce Naumann's Square Depression, which was made for the Munster sculpture exhibition some 30 years after the fact. And I was scanning the crowd slowly, and thumbnails for my own experience of the piece and thinking about how it was being used. And as time began to pass, I started to settle on one individual in particular who I thought, for me, was kind of the ideal user of this particular piece. And finally, I settled on definitely somebody who I thought sort of encapsulated the experience for me. And 3 years later, I finally met him, Dieter Roelstraete, with whom we'll hear later. But initially, this was a picture of a stranger, and now it's a picture of a friend. Now, certainly, the artists who I'll relieve you, Dieter. The artists who will speak today engage, I think, with this meeting of the personal with the public, particularly as the prevailing conventions of the latter are often employed to narrativize the world around us. These artists engage those cultural conventions and societal biases that give form even to the very display of art. And here, I'm thinking partly of the way in which, say, Danh Vo's installations can be said occasionally to extend Marcel Broteur's notion of decor, where the way in which the very exhibitionary complex itself is bound to a kind of colonialist vision and has a history to it. All this, I think, would be worth developing in a brief introduction. But for our purposes, I actually think it might be most worthwhile instead to offer a potential genealogy for today's conversation. And with that in mind, I'd like to consider how our interest in history now, and in counterpoint with a preoccupation with the contemporary in art, has a brief history of its own that's worth surmising in order to place our various presentations in context today. If a historical event per recours in the announcement for today's conversation, quote, receives its definition from its contribution to the development of a plot, then how is the plot unfolded in art as it leads to this particular moment? What definitions of this event might we arrive at now? And I'll leave it to Jan to discuss these pieces more, but just to give a sense of the presentational mode. In fact, I think many of the precedents and preoccupations for today's conversation found new, if not first, prominence in art roughly a decade ago. And I think in particular of Hal Foster's The Archival Impulse of 2002, in which he surveys a contemporary art field increasingly populated with, quote, artistic practice as an idiosyncratic probing into particular figures, objects, and events in modern art, philosophy, and history. Artworks by the likes of Thomas Hirshhorn, here you see a piece of his from the most recent Venice Biennale, Tacita Dean and Sam Durant, he says, might consist of cobbled together bits of newsprint and chaotic arrays of images on the one hand, or by outmoded pieces of military technology or political slogans of bygone days on the other. In this way, Foster says, the artists were, quote, connecting what could not be connected according to the prevailing logic of the day, prompting, for example, a reevaluation of mass media images by upsetting their informational status in Hirshhorn's kiosks and installations such as this, and as well, a reconsideration of the past as a still incomplete project by Tacita Dean in such works as Teignmouth Electron, a failed ship, a failed sailing mission around the world by Donald Crowhurst. And then on the island where his ship was marooned, utopian architecture by the French in this Caribbean island that was similarly abandoned. Yet most crucial, Foster would write, was how none of these projects assumed any integrity of long-standing institutions any longer, whether in art or society more generally, and so they didn't levy any kind of critique of them as such. And by this I mean they didn't tease latent narratives to the surface, be they power structures or systemic biases of cultural or societal structures. Rather, these artists simply suggested other ways of ordering information, underscoring, quote, the nature of all archival materials as found yet constructed, factual yet fictive, public yet private. And Foster would say, they did so from a desire to turn belatedness into becomingness. By reaching into the past and by using the material of failed futures, such as the Tacita Dean here, they could create the possibility for another future altogether. I think it might be hard for us now to recall the degree to which modernist motifs and notions of utopianism figured into artistic production and even conversation at that particular moment. And indeed, at the same time that one might say that this reflected a desire for a coherent artistic and political program in the face of pluralism, that there are so many different styles of art happening at one point that one could say in discourse there was a desire for a reason of contemporary art. Foster argues that, quote, a will to connect what cannot be connected was offering a way to read history as something other than traumatic in the wake of 9/11. Now, partly, however, I think the distance of this kind of memory is due to the sheer rise of the fictive element in such discussions around art, history, and narrative. This is, I think, problematic to an extent. I recall, for example, Carrie Lambert Beatty's excellent essay, Make-Believe, Parafiction, and Plausibility, in a recent issue of October, which details the rise of artwork during the past decade, whose character is totally ambiguous, such as Michael Blum's tribute to Safiye Bahar of 2005 in the Istanbul Biennial. And this is in a building as part of the biennial, what looks to be an actual apartment belonging to supposedly a close colleague and partner of Ataturk, who supposedly introduced democracy to Turkey, and this is completely a fictionalized environment, but you just couldn't tell. Or the yes men's posing as Dow Chemical executives admitting guilt in Bhopal. The question, I think, remains of whether pointing to a false history or using a false history or to the loss of veracity in our coordinates today when looking back at history is enough. Is this all we ask for from contemporary art? Now, alternatively, when it comes to historical and fictive enterprises, I'd say consider a reply by philosopher Jacques Renault in 2004 to the question of how we're to understand his claim that fiction essentially belongs to the domain of empirical reality, which he terms the aesthetic sovereignty of literature. It is, he says, a regime in which the logic of descriptive elements and narrative arrangements in fiction becomes fundamentally indistinct from the arrangements used in the description and interpretation of the social or historical world. Put another way, the fictive structures of art give us an aesthetic by which to reorder our encounters with the world. Now, on the one hand, I think his idea is drawing ostensibly on Friedrich Schiller and the aesthetic education of man. And on the other hand, I think that one could acknowledge a debt to Barthes and the idea that criticism itself is a poetic enterprise. One creates constellations of, one creates constellations of different events in order to create possible meanings and generate new ones, or even allow meanings to proliferate, as he would say. Now, the example Rancière uses is Chris Marker's documentary, The Last Bolshevik, which fictionalizes the history of Russia by cobbling together the story of filmmaker Alexander Medvedkin using different types of traces, interviews, archival documents, extracts from cinema. And all these things exist in a kind of parallel in the same stream of images. And I think this might be worthwhile looking ahead to ask what that means to put these things in one strand. But as Rancière would say here, politics and art, like forms of knowledge, construct fictions. That is to say, material arrangements of signs and images, relationships between what is seen and what is said, between what's done and what can be done. Now, here's Medvedkin. To draw us closer to the present before handing over the microphone to our various contributors today, I think one hears an echo here of Foster's notion of things being brought together that can't be brought together, a different organizational scheme that's forced by placing narrative details into novel patterns. Mobilize these schemes, provide other maps of the visible and fields of action, but it's this particular kind of fictive narrativizing that's been pronounced, I think, in art since 2005. In a recently published paper, the October piece that was mentioned in my own introduction, I wanted to point out, or I did point out, how various artists are going to particular places, and if decades ago we would see them teasing out the history of those places, more recently one finds these histories conjured but withheld so that another narrative can be introduced. the site becomes more like a setting, used as a kind of cinematic backdrop within which other stories are introduced and allowed to unfold. And so here in 2005 in Berlin, the Biennale, A Single Street, becomes a thematized narrative moving from birth to death through train stations, chapels, a former Jewish girls' school, and a cemetery. And as significant, the degree to which such a tactic, I think, correlates with mass commercial practices is made clear by artists such as Pierre Huyghe in works like Streamside Day Follies, in which he sought to introduce a new history to a town that hadn't existed yet. So there's a town in upstate New York that is literally being built, and in order to generate a history for the town, he seeks to introduce a what would be an annual event. So in an almost situationist way, you organize time in a particular way, and that not only choreographs the present, but supplies a false history that would legitimize it in some way. And to this, he says, it's basically like the merchandising of Halloween in France, which only began to exist some 15 years ago, I think. Now, in conclusion, I think that this very much informs our sense of the contemporary. What defines so much of the present is a battle for the past, the battle to supply the present with its narrative. If in commerce a brand wants to supply the consumer with a history of which he or she is a part, in art and in many curatorial efforts, the task is becoming one of managing the signs to create a historical legitimacy for individual practices. The present becomes a kind of battle for prehistories. And yet, looking to culture more broadly and to really bring it into the now, I'd like to suggest a truly critical turn in our conversation as it's happening at this moment, even if it's just in hypothesis. And here are more of the celebrations that were upstate. Reorganize my time, Pierre. If Foster once suggested that artists were putting things together that couldn't go together in order to create other narratives, then is this tactic even available to artists, or is another model more prevalent? And I think that we can actually take a look at Occupy Wall Street and how that is being presented or discussed in the media more generally, with criticisms among the latter to date putting forward the idea that there are no specific demands, nothing can be satisfied, and so there can be no end in sight, and there can be no specific purpose that allows for the generation of a narrative arc. As one interviewed protester said to Rushkoff on CNN, there's no phase, there's no political party with a mission to complete and then shut up shop. And so it's by not having a narrative that the protest is sustained. And as opposed to the archival work of 2002, this is not forcing things together, but rather keeping them apart so that a narrative never fully forms. It's by suspending history that not an event, but rather a way of behaving and operating becomes possible. And to tie this back to 2002 and those discussions of utopianism, the only other point of comparison for me is a conversation I once had with Homi Bhabha, where he was very interested in the idea of the war without borders, the idea of a war that could have no end, an endless war. And what happens when time is evacuated in that way? And if there's that kind of suspension in play, how might artists and art historians address that switch? I think that that actually might very much put forward a kind of sense of stakes. To introduce very briefly our contributors, first you'll be hearing from Matthew Buckingham, who's an American artist and filmmaker who studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, received a BA from the University of Iowa and an MFA from Bard College, and he attended the Whitney Independent Study Program as well. From 2003 to 2010, he taught at the Malmö Art Academy in Sweden, and this semester he's a visiting artist at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His work is also in the collections of many illustrious institutions, including the MCA Chicago and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Jaleh Mansoor, who completed her PhD at Columbia University in 2007, is assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, Having worked on materialist abstraction in the context of the Marshall Plan in Italy, she is interested in complicating the discourse on abstraction, totality, universality, labor, and mere life in contemporaneity. She works as a critic for Artforum and is frequently contributing to October, Texter Kunst, and most recently, the Journal of Aesthetics and Protest. She's also preparing a book that addresses formal and procedural violence in the work of Alberto Burri, Lucio Fontana, and Piero Manzoni, and another on mere life in the work of Santiago Sierra. Curator, editor, and writer, and good friend Dieter Roelstraete was trained as a philosopher at the University of Ghent and works as a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Antwerp. His curatorial projects there include Emotion Pictures, Intertitle, a survey show of contemporary art from Vancouver, The Order of Things, Liam Gillick and Lawrence Weiner, A Syntax of Dependency, and Arua, a thematic survey show coming up of contemporary art from Rio de Janeiro. He's currently preparing a retrospective of Chantal Akerman. And finally, among our contributors, artist Danh Vo was born in Vietnam and graduated from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen and the Städelschule in Frankfurt. He's had recent solo exhibitions at the Kunsthalle Friedrichshain, Kassel, Germany, the National Gallery Copenhagen, Artist Space in New York, and upcoming solo exhibitions of his work will take place at Kunsthaus Bregenz, Austria, the Renaissance Society in Chicago, and Art Speak, Vancouver. It is an illustrious group, and it's my privilege to be among them. So again, thank you. And without further ado, Matthew Buckingham.
Thank you, Tim. And I want to thank everyone at MIT. Excuse me. Especially David, Joao, Elise, Susanna, and it's such a great invitation for me. I was very, very excited to accept this chance to formally and consequently think through many of the things that I've been working with in most of my art projects, to connect the dots, as it were. And I'm just going to switch over here. Nope. No, I just want to start the slide. Is it, the play? Okay. Great. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit today about problems that arise in the process of thinking about the past and why I've worked to restage some of these problems in the art context. You wake up in the middle of the night. There you are again, the same person you were when you fell asleep, more or less. You squint your eyes and look around to get your bearings. Maybe you look at a clock. What time is it? Where am I? What happened last night? What do I need to do tomorrow? Scattered around you are the large and small personal archaeological clues that help you piece things together. We use memory, and by extension, the various constructions of time that most of us subscribe to, as primary tools for navigating our lives. Our sophisticated capacity for recall takes on countless forms, many of them unconscious. At the personal level, we speak of short and long-term memory, childhood memory, and the shared memory of families, and of social or even collective memory. As we move from the personal to the broader social spheres, these memory forms become increasingly symbolic, cultural, and representative. The historian John Lewis Gaddis says, "Memory is the only database we have. We know the future from having learned about the past. Without it, we'd have no sense of even these fundamental truths, to say nothing of the words with which to express them, or even who or where or what we are. We know the future only by the past we project into it." This calls attention to the lines we draw between past, present, and future, while confusing things enough to remind us of the deep continuity that William Faulkner referred to when he wrote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." According to John Lewis Gaddis, the long-running debate over history's capacity or incapacity for objectivity, the controversy around its status as a science, so to say, can be misleading, in that the comparison suggests that science itself has been constructed as objective or absolute. In his book, The Landscape of History, Gaddis reminds us that as it developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was science that moved closer to history, rather than the other way around. Through the work of Charles Lyell in geology and Charles Darwin in biology, science began to attempt to account in new ways for time, for changes that occur over what were, up until then, unimaginably long periods of time, so-called deep time. Gaddis draws parallels between the discipline of writing history and these and other sciences that engage in thought experiment, where reproducible laboratory experimentation is not possible. He concludes that science, history, and art have something in common. They all depend on metaphor, on the recognition of pattern, and on the realization that something is like something else. Elsewhere, Gaddis continues, "Culture, religion, technology, environment, and tradition can all transmit acquired skills and ideas, but history is arguably the best method for enlarging experience in such a way as to command the widest possible consensus on what the significance of that experience might be. In the hands of many writers, the fiction of history is to imagine the real. History makes reality desirable, often creating the illusion that it is speaking itself, as if it simply happened. But of course, upon more conscious examination, we see that the fiction is always a construction, a story that opens a debate around its own meaning. Stories are necessarily structured by their silences, by the infinite number of things that every story leaves out. Silence occludes the ordinary, the implied, the everyday, the unexceptional, everything not considered important enough to be mentioned. Yet the significance of past events always appears in these ordinary moments, experienced by people whose names we rarely know. That's why the quotidian becomes a limit for understanding and a limit for speaking about the past. So in that sense, according to Gaddis, even though it constitutes everything, the past is something we can never have. For by the time we've become aware of what has happened, it's already inaccessible to us. We cannot relive, retrieve, or rerun it as we might a laboratory experiment or a computer simulation. We can only represent it. Positioning ourselves as closely as possible to those limits of narration and representation, we must ask ourselves if our own narratives are adequate to our needs, and if not, how we might construct new ones. Some historians and their critics, especially their critics, would ask for much more. Keith Jenkins, for instance, draws a line between memory and history, placing each in a distinctly separate category. Jenkins does not see history and memory as part of a continuum, the way Gaddis does. For Jenkins, memory is only a metaphorical aspect of academic history, and a deceptive metaphor at that. For Jenkins, this is because memory is a natural phenomena, while history is discursive and literary. Memory operates at the level of experience, while history attempts unsuccessfully, in Jenkins' view, to recreate experience, or at least to provide a model with which to imagine it. The basic problem is that, as a theory, history has no object other than the absent past that is created by the discourse of history itself. How long is the shoreline of Lake Ontario? The meteorologist Louis Richardson might say that there is no definitive answer, and any number of miles or kilometers we come up with when we measure it will depend on what tool we select for the task. Smaller units of measure will allow for more detail and result in a larger number. This is a dilemma that reveals the privilege and the power of the map maker. Negotiating the relationship of information to scale. Large maps are more accurate, but a truly literal representation of any entity could only be the entity itself. Gaddis admits that writing history also necessarily entails these manipulations of time and scale. But he does not see this as a sign that history or cartography is purely relative. Instead, he believes that these qualities construct history writing and map making as fields of contestation, where the meanings of competing representations can and must be debated. Narratives, just like maps, become meaningful through the ways they are used, through their adequacy or inadequacy. But maps do have objects, and they not only reference objects that they not only reference, but to which they physically direct us. When we arrive on a cartographic scene, we immediately compare it to our sensory experience, verifying or invalidating the representation we have been given, even when it comes to us in the form of a moving image playing on a GPS screen. But when we read a story about the past or past events, there is no easy correlative, no ready possibility of verification. If anything, once we become aware of the structuring silence that surrounds all storytelling, our attention is constantly drawn to the subplots concerning missing objects and absent reference, which sometimes justifiably overwhelm the main narrative. But the long debate over the validity of historical knowledge, a much longer debate than we often acknowledge, has almost systematically ignored one of history writing's closest cousins, journalism. When we read about or are told of events that have occurred in the immediate past, but at a great spatial distance from us, how are we to interpret what we read or what we hear? Even Hayden White, perhaps with great resignation, acknowledges periodically in his work that as human beings we may be stuck with narrative as the dominant system for understanding and moving through the world. But perhaps our ideas about history are a bit tangled and often less than clear because the ways that we experience and conceive of time itself are somewhat ambiguous. The relationship between our categories of memory and history, even so-called lowercase history, is troubled. Psychologists define time as a continuum lacking spatial dimensions. They say we perceive time internally as a succession, an experience of ideas or thoughts succeeding one another. This succession, with its slightly overlapping incoming and outgoing impressions, produces within us a feeling of, quote, earlier and later. William James, in his book, The Principles of Psychology, written here in Cambridge, of course, in 1890, quotes the English philosopher Shadworth Hodgson, saying, "We divide the course of time into past, present, and future. We call loosely, what we call loosely the present is an empirical portion of the course of time in which the instant of change is the present time point." William James claims that this instant of change, dividing the past from the future, is an indivisible and imperceptible line. Being of no duration, we never perceive it directly. Instead, our senses make the line wide enough to stand on, as it were, or, as James would have it, to sit on. He says, "The practically cognized present is no knife edge, but a saddleback, with a certain breadth of its own on which we sit perched and from which we look in two directions into time." For this reason, James calls our perception of the present moment the specious or false present. The specious present is that duration of time which that can be apprehended without the use of memory. Empirically tested to range between 5 and 12 seconds. The span of time covered by a single act of awareness. James continues, "Beyond its borders extends the immense region of conceived time, past and future, into one direction or another of which we mentally project all the events which we think of as real. The further we venture into this region, the further we are from lived experience. When extending these processes of memory, by analogy, to events that have occurred outside our experience or our lifetime, we enter into the discursive and literary realms of the past." John Lewis Gaddis sees these journeys as critical and obligatory. He takes up history as a tool for navigating between oppression and liberation, as the means by which a culture has a chance to question and debate beyond the limits of its own senses. Max Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School formulated the task of the historian in part as the task of preserving the memory of suffering in order to foster demand for qualitative historical change. The continuity of time that Faulkner wrote about, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, a past that's never dead, means that history is not something that is over and done with, or even resolved, but instead constitutes everything around us, our lived present moment. In that sense, we are the vanishing point of history, history's horizon line. We are confronted with these complex relations of time and place when we look at or listen to recorded media. Photography, film, and video, and recorded audio partly confuse the present, always insisting on something that was, tying images to the people and places depicted in them, where they are found and where they are viewed. As Roland Barthes might have said, in terms of language, the tense of recorded images and sound is "this will have been," a kind of paradoxical future past tense. This ambiguity always provokes speculation and interpretation. It always concerns at least 3 points: the subject photographed, the photographer, and the viewer. As Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, an image is nothing else than a relationship. As an artist, I've experimented with history, quote-unquote, reading art and art reading history. If art is producing a type of knowledge, which I believe it does, or is somehow a way of knowing, I see this as part of the process by which we make meaning from ambiguity. Or, when writing history, begin to lift off certain burdens of the past. By bringing it into the art context, I'm not interested in putting history on display, but instead in experiencing history's methods and problems, and turning these problems over to the viewer in forms that are less synthesized than those we often encounter. What can happen when a story is told or retold at a specific time and place? When the viewer must partly become historian while seeing themselves as subjects at the same moment. This move fails many of the objectives of written history, while possibly expanding the toolkit for navigating between oppression and liberation. I'm interested in asking, what kind of historical thinking and consciousness could this be? I thought it might be useful to look at a quick example, an excerpt from a project video installation. I'm just going to switch over to the DVD. And I'm actually going to switch DVDs. Sorry. The context is here at the beginning, and an installation view. And I'll let you watch it. which deals with the biography of a woman named Charlotte Wolff, who fled Nazi Germany in 1933, initially going to Paris and then on to London. And what I was interested in addressing was her return to Berlin near the end of her life, her conscious decision to go back to Berlin, but also to think about the mental space of her return to London after the trip to Berlin. The first moments where she would have been suspended in this placeless place of an airplane, thinking about her journey and, of course, the longer time frame of her life. And I just throw that up as an example of a kind of visual or material interest in a non-space, so to say, this airplane of the 1970s, which you see images on one screen while keeping track of this written narrative. The project was shot on an airplane that I discovered, which had been retired around the year that Charlotte Wolff made her voyage, her trip to Berlin. And so everything was shot inside this plane that had that connection with that moment. It was not the plane that she was on, but that is also made sort of clear, I think, in the project itself. So I'll close there, and I look forward to the discussion and your questions and comments a little bit later.